Europe is a magical continent, for better or for worse reasons, but there's so much there that we have to leverage and utilize, and we're not doing so for whatever reason, and we need to be much more cognizant of the new realities that we're in. So, I mean, on that note, as we begin to wind down for this great back and forth, what do you think would be, the main points you want to leave viewers, listeners with?
I think it's important to just acknowledge that it's okay to be shocked, it's okay to be freaked out, number one. Number two, giving up on politics when it's going badly is the worst time to give up on politics. And even when avenues for action are more constricted than before, it's really important to realize that participating in politics, even at the level of talking about politics to people in your life, that it's important to be politically awake and that makes a difference. Things like democracies don't collapse in a binary way.
This is The Global Gambit.
All right, well, Vlad, part two. I think... we ended on the point of Vance's notable comments in Munich Security Conference. And you are, I think, doing a very extensive job of breaking down the various views of European, American, transatlantic relations. So, if we build on what the Munich Security Conference was sort of demonstrating, is this largely the end of transatlanticism? Are US-European relations at this point beyond repair, or are the Europeans going to try to sort of weather the storm and hold out for a more moderate government again at the end of Trump's term?
I think that most people in European corridors of power will still have the fantasy of deliverance from the aberrations of recent historical experience. So let's hope that there is some kind of reset in the United States in 2028, and the longer run picture of the transatlantic alliance gets renormalized. I'm skeptical about that because you have to ask questions about why Trump won. And I don't actually regard Trump as a particularly strong candidate. I think he has certain communicative talents of genius, but the primary reason Trump won, in my view, is the spectacular failure of what I call the inarticulacy of technocratic centrism. So once you analyze the question of why Trump won, you have to recognize that there are social forces pushing on that kind of politics that are going to stay with us. And that means that, of course, the Democrats can win in 2028, but the reality is that if we're to see either the Biden presidency or Trump as an aberration, it's probably more intelligent and prudent to see Biden's term as an aberration and Trump as a version of normal. So I do think we are seeing, in part at least, an irrevocable transformation in the transatlantic alliance on a scale that, will take us back to the experience after the Second World War. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is falling apart, but it certainly means that we are in a new world in which the old security architecture simply will never be got back to a place it works properly. Article 5 will never be strong again. It's done. It's not going to be strong in 5 years, not going to be strong in 10 years. I think the projection there should be that it simply carries on weakening. So there is no way that whatever damage has been already done to our security architecture, and we've got to put that point about damage in the context that we already had a largely collapsed global order. The post-1989 global order was, let's say, halfway down to being collapsed. Now it's been degraded further with a clear perception that Article 5 is not a reliable guarantee anymore. I do not think there is any way back via the same institutional route to security and stability in Western alliances. If we're going to get back to a more stable place, it'll have to be probably in the future with new arrangements that either replace or more realistically supplement the current arrangements we have. So it doesn't mean the formal dissolution of NATO, but it probably means some new alliances, some new modes of international organization that could get us there in the next quarter century. But I don't see a way of doing a kind of an entire repair job on the arrangements we currently have. I think that we could slow down how far they keep breaking, but that's probably the best we can do. There is no way to go back to even a few weeks ago, let alone 20 years ago, when something like Article 5 would have felt extremely secure.
So is this the end of NATO then?
It's not the end of NATO, but it's a pattern of dissolution.
What does that mean?
Much the same is happening in the European Union. That's to say, it's not that we're going to experience some kind of singular crisis that's going to break NATO, but it's simply that we're going to have a less functional and a less reliable NATO.
But translate that into policy, into action. What does that mean?
It means that if there's a low threshold challenge of Article 5 by Putin in 5 years, the United States will probably not do anything.
Right. Okay. They might supply logistical support or intel, but it's up to the Europeans to do the kinetic sort of action.
We hope to be wrong about that, but yes, the practical consequence is that if you're sitting in the Baltics now, you cannot have faith that Article 5 will protect you in 2030 if, God forbid, something goes wrong. I think that's one of the practical consequences. I think what I'm saying is that there is no way to re-strengthen Article 5 to the kind of strength it had 20 years ago. I think we're either going to have a weakened Article 5 or we're going to have alternative security arrangements that meet our needs in a way we can't anticipate at the moment.
Right, okay. And so when it comes to then the relationship of the EU to NATO, or, which countries can you see being the sort of de facto leaders of this, right? Macron has always tried to position himself as the busy guy who wants to bring everybody together, be the facilitator, he likes to be the house party host. So, is he at the head? What about, Starmer, Germany? We've just had an election. I'm curious for your thoughts there with the new chancellor incoming.
I think that if I were to make a generalization about it, it'd be the European powers that do their best to keep populist right political forces out of power. I think that the most strategically incoherent European powers over the next 10 years will be the powers where what we might call the populist right, or sometimes call it the post-truth right, the exclusionary right, gains a foothold. So I think that the central difference maker in answer to your question will be what happens in the next election cycle. And we can be optimistic about the relative underperformance, arguably, of the Alternative for Germany in this election we've just had. But the point is what's going to happen in the next election cycle and the one after. And I think that will decide which voices in Europe have a capacity to coherently engage with the security challenges Europe faces, as opposed to a willingness to concede a power to impact our security to some kind of Russo-Chinese alliance. If we have Le Pen and the AfD, in power in France and Germany, that'll be a very different picture to a situation where we have more responsible politicians who take institutions within their democracy and what is left of the international institutions more seriously. So I think that's going to be the central, deciding factor. How far are the big democracies of Europe bogged down in domestic crisis that makes them unable to come up with anything coherent when it comes to regional security?
Yeah, and so what of then the other side? The images, the footage coming out of the White House, again, just to sort of put it in real time of what's been happening, and just generally what's happening at the Munich Security Conference and the optics around sort of the United States leadership towards Ukraine. What on earth do you think the Kremlin is thinking? We touched upon it earlier, but more specifically, you know, about US leadership and relative stability as a leader, as a great power. They must be, you know, reeling their hands with glee in the Kremlin or even in Beijing, right?
Well, I think you probably know a little bit more about the exchange between Trump and Zelensky. I stopped watching it early on. What I saw was Trump making a mocking comment about how Zelensky was dressed. And he said, "Oh, you've come really well dressed." And then I just saw a kind of disengaged mode from Trump, whereby he wasn't relying on Zelensky for his narcissistic supply the way he was with Macron and with Starmer, which meant that Trump was much more alive and engaged. But you're saying you've seen a very unlovely confrontation between them. That's very disconcerting. The Russians will be loving this. As you may know, I often talk about this kind of Fukuyamianism in reverse, a kind of a view of Western decline the Russians have as having a kind of inevitability. Mm-hmm. So they expect things to go very wrong for us. They think that that's inexorable, and they're going to be wondering if this is it. I do think that they are also quite clear that they have a certain affinity with Trump that they didn't have with previous US leaders, even if Trump were to take a difficult stance against them. And I think that's partly because they see all of the talk about democracy and counter-majoritarian institutions and human rights as sort of ephemeral, hubristic noise. It doesn't really connect up to reality. The Kremlin doesn't really believe in democracy as anything that's ever existed. They don't think that democracy is real. They think that that's just a hubristic label we give to the power dynamics we engage in our societies. So I think that's one way in which the Kremlin prefers Trump to conventional technocratic leaders. Another way is that they have an ideological affinity. And the ideological affinity is about the idea that you can go around the world and try to buy everything, and what you can't buy, you might get by force. And Trump doesn't share many of the fascist elements of Putinism. But there is this kind of hyper-neoliberal element whereby if you're a major power, you should really be able to go around buying everything up, and what you can't buy, you should be able to threaten into submissiveness or conquer. That, as a dispositional state, is something that the Kremlin shares with Trump. It's not an accident that they share it, because this sort of ideological item is doing the rounds globally now. It is an item that is present in many of the manifestations of this global authoritarian wave. In other words, Trump is a version of Putinism in some respect. In other respects, he isn't. But that's not a trivial historical thing to say. That's a bit real. And so they're going to have more affinity there. But the key question the Russians are asking is, what degree of co-option is Trump going to experience? He got co-opted in their view in the first term. Is he going to get co-opted again? Or is he going to be able to break away from the system as they see it? And if he can, then they think they'll be able to deal with him.
Yeah. No, I think it's going to be a huge element. I mean, I made a video relatively recently on neo-imperialism, on this idea that America is shifting towards the doctrine of might of right, and that smaller states are simply cut up by the bigger ones. You know, I even quoted, I think it was Thucydides, you know, the strong do what they want and the weak suffer what they must. Well, there along the lines, I forgot the exact quote, but it's you know, we're returning where the US isn't sort of supporting weaker states. They are as willing to go to the extent of revisionism, even revanchism in some ways, with Trump's threats over Greenland and Panama and such. So do you think there could be a time where it is literally the Europeans, not versus completely the United States, but sort of we're at such antipathy that we're in this complete new normal?
I think that there's every chance that it's not going to be possible again for Europe to see the United States as a reliable ally, but there's a risk of a negative sort of convergence between Europe and the United States if our own politics goes too much in the Trumpian direction. And then we're going to have a happier merry-go-round between the European capitals and Washington and indeed the Kremlin. So funnily enough, that scenario of European alienation from Trumpist kind of politics that's sort of tumbling out of the remnants of the international order as they were before. Well, that's not the worst case scenario, because it still means that the European powers still somehow have their act together democratically. But that's not guaranteed, and there could be a reconvergence across the board. And just the other day, when Glenn Greenwald was interviewing Mr. Dugin, the philosophical entertainer and entrepreneur, who doesn't have any influence over Putin, but is still really important because he actually frames a lot of the ideological texture of the Putin regime. He said to Glenn Greenwald, well, look, if we've got the AfD and Le Pen in power, they're not going to look at Russia as an authoritarian state. They're going to look at us and say, well, maybe Russian elections are actually not that unfair. So that's an important risk toward which we are traveling, but which we need to avoid. The best case scenario is, of course, a repatch of the transatlantic relationship, but it can't ever be returned back to what it was, because there is no longer the confidence that you're going to know where you stand 4 years on.
Yeah, no, I think that's why we're reaching such a, what's the word? What's the word? A paradigm shift. We are in a paradigm shift when it comes to so many elements, but European security being absolutely at the forefront of this, also the United States place in the world, which seeps into European security, of which Ukraine is a subset, a factor of. And generally a sort of dismantlement of the post-World War II order, that the United States, United Kingdom have been huge drivers of in terms of just international norms and values, rule of law. I don't know. I mean, it makes me begin to wonder whether the United Nations can even begin to withstand this sort of dissolution. How far do you think this could go?
This will go quite far unless Western countries learn to speak to their populations in the way they can't at the moment. I mean, we've got a crisis of legitimacy that sort of divides what large numbers of citizens feel and what their governments are up to. And that's not just a policy divide, it's a kind of communication divide. Politics feels not even a kind of enterprise that leaves you powerless or even betrayed. It feels an enterprise that's removed and unintelligible. And that reconnect, both on style and on policy, really is something that we need to work on. Immigration is one of the central issues there. There's a big gap between the economics-based immigration policies that Western states engaged in, what they can garner civic consent for from their citizenries. We do not have civic consent for the immigration policies we have in many Western states. That's a really big crisis. Unless we have more reconnect between what large minorities or small majorities of Western citizens feel in the United States, in Canada, in France, in the UK, then we're going to keep on spiraling. So the central pillar here to get right is to fix that slide in domestic politics. Unless we fix it, I'm extremely pessimistic about our capacity to stand up for ourselves or even know what we want on the international stage.
So what do you think should be some of the steps made?
On that particular issue, I think that we need to, funnily enough, actually take one of the few good bits from J.D. Vance's speech, which I do think is a disgraceful and pathetic speech. But one of the things that he implied in it, with bad examples that need to be fact-checked actually and debunked, but is that we need a broader circle of discourse in our democracies. We need to stop pretending that we have won arguments we haven't won. We should not have institutions going around pretending that they have convinced their citizenries of arguments they haven't convinced them of. So we should have an understanding that you have to engage with what millions of people feel on the doorstep. You have to take that through issue by issue by issue by issue. You need a new style of communication with populations. You need practical steps toward democratic regeneration, which means keeping the institutions we have, but supplementing them with new institutions at a local level, especially, for instance, citizens' assemblies, which allow people to feel that they can touch politics and that something can change as a result of them touching politics. You and I have gone to a meeting together in our part of London, and suddenly the speed limits are changed, and there are a couple of benches in the park as a result of us talking to each other in some kind of local chamber, local context. So there's this element of sort of re-enlivening of democracy. And there's also a serious conversation, quite frankly, about economic exclusion. Partly what happened in the United States is that busy and stressed working class Americans felt they've been abandoned by politics. Then another layer is the state of social media, where we're facing a crisis without solutions because we have all of these, if you like, democratically illegitimate public spaces, which are arbitrarily controlled essentially by potato chip companies. We're seeing the most egregious example of that on Twitter. And we don't have solutions for this. But that way of engaging is not sustainable. So we certainly need a real public conversation about what shape we want these public spaces to have. It needs to be a deeper conversation than the censorship conversation, because our censorship conversation is a conversation about the extent of control of speech. But there's an even more important factor to discuss, which is who has the power to control that speech, right? In whose hands are all of these platforms? Why is it that we can't have democratic oversight over how the algorithm works? So across a range of issues, we need to halt disconnect between citizens and their governments. We need to engage in some attempts of democratic regeneration, and we need to come clean and accept that we are having a bit of a crisis of legitimacy and not pretend that everything is normal, and that the people who are feeling profoundly alienated and voting for Marie Le Pen are just irrational or racist or under the impact of malign foreign interference. So we need to resurrect the kind of decency and solidarity toward voters who vote for parties that you and I may happen to think are destructive or counterproductive. So that means engaging with Trump voters, trying to win them back. Somebody might argue, but come on, isn't the Joe Biden administration an example of relatively progressive politics? And I think that conversation would have to go in two directions. One is what more could have been done, but two is whatever reforms Biden tried to implement, they were not accompanied by a vision for the country and the conversation about that. So funnily enough, I think that all the foreign stuff is downstream from the domestic stuff. I mean, that's sort of my boring mantra that I keep repeating. Strategic incapacity on the foreign stage as a consequence of democratic incapacity at home. That's the equation as I see it. And we can't fix our foreign policy unless we change some of the profound toxic dynamics in our democracies.
Yeah, no, I agree. I want Europe to succeed. I'm a huge Europeanist, pan-Europeanist. I don't know if I, want a United States of Europe, but I think Europe needs to get up, get a hold of itself, step up, and really, Europe is a magical continent, for better or for worse reasons. But there's so much there that we have to leverage and utilize, and we're not doing so for whatever reason. And we need to be much more cognizant of the new realities that we're in. So, I mean, on that note, as we begin to wind down for this great back and forth, what do you think would be, the main points you want to leave viewers, listeners with?
I think the main point is that it's okay to freak out about everything we've been discussing, and that that in private life we often think that when big things, dramatic things happen, it takes us 18 months or 2 years to just regather ourselves and stabilize ourselves physiologically. I think a lot of viewers, certainly on my channels, and I think your viewers too, are feeling this discombobulation. So I think it's important to just acknowledge that it's okay to be shocked. It's okay to be freaked out. Number one. Number two, giving up on politics when it's going badly is the worst time to give up on politics. And even when avenues for action are more constricted than before, it's really important to realize that participating in politics, even at the level of talking about politics to people in your life, is important, that it's important to be politically awake, and that makes a difference. Things like democracies don't collapse in a binary way. They degrade a little bit more, a little bit less, and that makes an actual difference to real lives. If you talk about foreign policy, in this case, we could be talking about Western efficacy making a difference to actual lives in Ukraine. And then I think it's important to just galvanize ourselves by looking at the fact that what's happening is bad, but not as bad as some things humans went through, even in recent history, the last century or so, right? But many folks walking around on the ruins of the Second World War in Europe who had no idea what the future held, who had no idea what kind of alliances there might be, what life might be like. So human beings acted with faith and resilience and hope in screwed up situations that were even more difficult than ours. And I think the next thing I would say is that at the level of what citizens can do, this idea of being able to talk to people who see politics differently to you is very important. And that doesn't mean that you have to engage with trolls online with whom you can't have a constructive conversation, but just the idea of regarding most voters, all voters in your country, as folks who share a table of politics with you, even if you disagree, is profoundly important, because what we're going to be tested on is how far can we keep a sense of solidarity, even when our disagreements get more and more toxic. And what we have to understand is that we actually can do better than we're doing. We're being a little bit snowflakey at wanting to check out of political conflicts just because we're offended by the other side. But if you look at a very profoundly toxic political society like Russia, for example, what you've got there are actually citizens, some of whom, millions of citizens, who think that Stalin was the best thing since sliced bread, and that Stalin was as bad a monster and a criminal as Hitler. And there are people, sharing a society, disagreeing about that. It'd be almost like the Europeans disagreeing about Hitler. Well, we're beginning to trend a little bit in that direction, but only very slightly. So it's important to, also realize that keeping a sense of solidarity means eating a lot of shit when you engage with fellow citizens.
Wow.
So that's all at the level of, personal engagement. And then at the level of actual politicians representing you and doing their job, the key thing to watch out for is not how right-wing or left-wing somebody is, but whether they are out to break democratic institutions or not. Is this politician who you're trying to weigh up whether you're going to vote for them out to degrade the judiciary, muzzle the courts, screw over the universities and so on, undermine free journalism or not? That's the key binary that I think is very important for citizens to keep in mind. It's not always easy because almost all voters who are voting for whoever they're voting think they are voting for freedom and democracy. The Trump vote is a liberatory vote. From the point of view of those casting that vote. It's important to acknowledge that. But I think it's this key issue. Is somebody out to break democratic institutions or are they not? And if they're not, consider allying with them, even if you're a socialist and they are particularly right-wing free marketeer. Because if you're both committed to sustaining majoritarian institutions, if you're both committed to a situation where you want politicians you vote for to be voted out of power in a free election, then you can be allies together even if you disagree. That the key folks to watch out for are folks who want to orchestrate a kind of degradation or even a sort of revolutionary wave against your institutions. If you lose your institutions, you can't do anything. You can't do foreign policy. You can't do climate policy. You can't build roads. So that's the key thing, that if we lose our institutions, we are going to be incapacitated across the board, no matter what you care about politically. It doesn't matter.
No, absolutely. I think that the de-democratization process is a big scary one, and I think that's a great note by which to bring our point to close of how we try to bridge that gap. Right, the Overton window is moving, and the political polarization is worse than I have ever seen, or many people who are much older than me with experience have ever seen. But I have to be less optimistic than you, Vlad, in what the future holds for sort of history, and that times are pretty bad at the moment, and I'm very fearful of a repeat of maybe not exactly a World War II, but that's the reason why I think there's so much apprehension and fear at the moment, because of the repeats of what's happening from 100 years ago. So
well,
I agree, but I also disagree.
I'm afraid I'm not able to push back on that.
Yeah, so we'll have to leave it on that tantalizing note for when you come back, hopefully sooner again. But as always, everyone, do check out Vlad's work and channel. He does amazing commentary. And, if you enjoyed the conversation, then give it a share and a subscribe and all that jazz. And we'll see you all next time. As we say on the Global Gambit, you've got to get playing or be played. Take care.